Hey, folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. You've got Mr. Spencer here and myself, Brad. In this episode, we're going to talk about what makes a great pen test report. That's kind of the direction we want to go. Obviously, we're going to give you all the answers and irrefutable proof that our way is the best way. Just kidding. But we do have some pretty good ideas on what we think makes a good report, and also really what you should be looking for in a pen test report, should you go through the process. So Spencer, this one is your brainchild. I really love it. So kind of prep the landscape for us a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. So the idea of this episode is, thinking through the pen test process, the offensive security process, and looking at different components of that process and what are, the really important bits and pieces. Obviously, the engagement is important. It's important to, conduct the penetration test appropriately and get coverage, follow a methodology, an industry recognized methodology and all that. But this is really focused on the report. And the report is, it is the crucial deliverable of a penetration test, right? It's the culmination of all the work that you've done, all the effort that's been done in the testing, in the pre-engagement, working with the client to understand their goals, and identifying vulnerabilities and things like that. And it's not only provides insight into the organization's security posture, but it's also a roadmap for that organization, for that firm, for addressing vulnerabilities, improving their overall security, improving detection response, just more or less overall improving the security posture of that organization. And the report is that main deliverable, right?
Yep.
So that's kind of the starting point for this. It's kind of the idea of this episode is, what makes a good report, or what makes a great report, rather. How do we construct it in a way that's helpful for an IT or security team? How do we give them the information that they need to be successful in remediating vulnerabilities, hardening their environments, and making them more resilient to attack?
Yeah, and I mean, to your point, man, this is what you paid for. Right. And I don't think anybody would argue that pen testing is an expensive endeavor. It can be a heavy lift, especially depending on what kind of testing you're doing. Like if you're doing internal or web, like there's hours of work that go into the preparation for this thing. So my point being is, this is literally the deliverable. It's the only proof you have that something happened. And like you said, it really kind of provides all the downstream guidance to what to do after. So if the report's not good, then you could probably say the pen test is not good, right?
Yeah.
Because it's the thing that you're actually getting as a result of the work.
Yeah, and you can either steer clients in the wrong direction or focusing on the wrong things, or you can help them focus on the things that are true present risks that actually have impact to the organization, to the business. So it can go both ways, and hopefully these are things that will help firms, help IT teams, steer their remediations in the right direction.
Agreed. All right. So number one, I guess we could kind of go in order of like start to finish of the report. It looks like the way you have the notes organized, which I think is really smart. So what's the first thing you look for in a good report, in a great report, when you're looking at one?
Yeah, I think the first thing, and maybe the most important thing, is understanding the audience, right? Understanding that there's going to be technical and non-technical folks who are probably going to look at that report. There could be third parties, auditors looking at that report. So there could be a variety of different people reading these reports that we're creating. So we have to keep that in mind when we're drafting the findings, when we're writing executive summaries. So really understanding the audience, making sure that there is some language to speak to the executives who are maybe not, for example, if we do a penetration test and there's some certificate template abuse, that's possible, right? Maybe there's some vulnerable certificate templates. Maybe there's ESE1 or ESE4 and yada, yada. You start using these words that mean things to people who are doing that work. But for executives, they're like, it needs to be in a language that they understand. So articulating things in the context of risk, talking about it like risk, instead of the nitty gritty technical details is important. And on the opposite, focusing on the technical bits for the technical people, so they know exactly where to go to kind of pinpoint what that vulnerability is, where to remediate it, and things like that. So I think understanding your audience is a good first step to kind of looking at, does this report deliver on what I want it to deliver?
100% agree with that, man. And there are some other things that I look for in executive summary, just because, and to frame my perspective, I spent a lot of years in the financial industry, in banks and credit unions, and my focus was pen testing in that context. And a lot of my job was reviewing other people's pen test reports, right? So like if we wanted to do business with a vendor, we would ask if they had a pen test, we would request the report. In a lot of cases, all we would get was the executive summary, right? Understandably so, right? They don't want to show us the keys to their kingdom. But one of the things that we saw over and over again is a lack of key details. Like when was it done? How many days did it take, right? How much effort was put in? What was the scope? These are the things that I think are crucial, if not in the executive summary, included in that introductory section of the report, because it frames the rest of the report, right? If the only thing that was tested in an external pen test was one IP, that's not a very comprehensive test, right? And so, so having those key pieces of information, if the test was performed 2 years ago, I'm pretty sure their environment has changed since then. So that test is no longer valid. So those are the kind of things I would look for when I was reviewing, vendor assessment penetration test reports. So there are key elements that must be present in addition to a good, well-written, I like to think of it like paragraph format, in the executive summary. So.
Yep. And I think, dovetailing off of that, I think you touched on something that I think is important is scope is important. Understanding what was tested, when it was tested, how it was tested is important too. So kind of jumping through our list a little bit, but I think it's important in this context is the methodology that was used.
Oh yeah.
Right? When we do internal pen tests, right? We do internal assume breach pen test. That's a common thing that we do. That's very different from a traditional network penetration test.
It is.
And so the methodology is going to be different. The approach is going to be different. So having that in the report is something that's useful to an IT team, right? If they take the report, right, and they do an internal pen test with Secure IT 360, it's going to look a certain way. It's going to be done a certain way. There's a certain methodology, still following industry best practices and industry frameworks, right? But kind of adopting it and adapting it to our own, style. They go and they do another pen test with another firm the next year. It's going to be different, right? As much as we would like it to be the same, it is going to be different slightly, even if it's the same exact type of assessment, same internal pen test, right?
Agreed.
They're going to have different methodologies, different processes, different workflows. So having that in the report is helpful so we can see, so the client or the organization could say, okay, we did an internal pen test. This is what it looked like. This was their methodology. This was their process. Here's this one this next year that we did. This is that process. This is how they did it. And kind of marrying those up, the organization can kind of look at that and say, okay, these are the vulnerabilities that were found because of this methodology. Likewise with this methodology. And I think that's important too in pen test reports. And something I think gets missed a lot is how exactly was it performed?
Yep. So in my experience in that previous context that I had mentioned, that was the number one complaint I had about pen test reports. And it was usually in the context of web apps, right? So like we want to use this vendor's web application. Let's say we use an online banking platform. We would ask them, hey, have you got a pen test? And they're like, oh yeah, totally, dude. And they would give us something and it would either not have methodology at all, which means we have no idea what was actually tested, or it would have something that is not a methodology listed as a methodology. And that would be a big red flag for us. For example, the OWASP top 10, love you, David Witcher, but that's not a methodology, right? That is a group of web application vulnerabilities that are frequently observed and common in the web application space with the intention of raising awareness. It is not a methodology. So when you see that this app was tested against the OWASP top 10, that's cool. Value in that. That's not a methodology. All right. So the web testing guide, the OWASP web testing guide, is a methodology, right? The PTES is a methodology. And so, that is a comprehensive list of test cases and test criteria that are to be performed. And they include things like what should be in a good report, right? They include things like what does the actual engagement workflow feel like and smell like? And so, methodology to me is arguably one of the most important things in a report, because without it, you have no idea what work was done.
Yep. And it's something that can be is usually changes, right? A good methodology, I mean, you could argue a good methodology shouldn't change too much, but with security tools, with the way security landscape is, a methodology, it changes, it adapts. I mean, even in
Sure.
our own processes, it's adapted multiple times throughout the last few years. So it is something that is important to have in a report and say, this is how it was done.
Agreed. 100%.
So the next thing I think is important is, you've got through the executive summary, you've got through the charts and all the pretty pictures, and now you're getting into the actual vulnerabilities, right?
Yep.
Something that I think is important is, and we mentioned earlier, is risk, right? Does the report articulate the risk of a given vulnerability or a series of vulnerabilities or a chain or whatever the case may be? Does it articulate the true risk of that vulnerability? Does it describe why the thing is a problem, and how it can kind of impact the organization? And I think that's the next kind of discussion point to a good report, or a great report in this case.
Agreed. Well, and I think it goes back to, what are we trying to accomplish, right? What is the goal of the work? And the goal of the work is to identify and assist in mitigation of risk. And I think if you boil down a penetration test to that simple goal, then I think it makes this aspect more clear. Yes, we have to do a good job of clearly presenting it. And I think it's important to present it in that framework that you described, right? And what I mean by that is communicate it in the context of risk, because impact is not risk. Impact is a component of risk, right? And we don't need to get into, like, you could go take the CISSP for yourself if you want to learn all that junk. But the point, you're right. Yeah, it's on that side. But the point is this, right? If I'm an executive and I'm the project sponsor and I want to pen test, the goal is find the things I care about so that I can reduce the risk to my company, right? And that's what we want to accomplish with this.
Yeah, and with a penetration test report, a lot of this stuff is going to be, here's this vulnerability, here's how that vulnerability can be realized. Here's the proof of concept that this thing is actually a vulnerability, and here's what that means, right? How can that attack be realized? How can that attack be, or how can those vulnerabilities be, chained together to achieve some result that a bad actor might want to achieve, right?
Yeah.
So that's important, is articulating those things, how those vulnerabilities can manifest themselves, and how that can be used to achieve some sort of goal that a bad actor would want to do.
Agreed with that. And I think part of that comes into risk metrics, right? To impact metric, risk metrics. And we use the CBSS version 3 here at Security 360. By the way, CBSS version 4 comes out in 27 days. And so we're probably going to let that one bake for a little while before we adopt it, just to see that it, how the industry looks at it. But eventually, I'm sure we'll move to version 4. The reason that I like CBSS is it's got a pretty clear, simple calculator, right? Can this thing be exploited via the network? How is the scope impacted? These are questions you have to answer in order to calculate the CBSS rating. However, I don't think the CBSS is the most important thing. I think the context is not often enough considered, and that falls on us as pen testers to communicate properly, just like your notes here show. Is framing context in the finding. Because if all I give you is, this is a CBSS version 7, it's a high. Is 7 a high? I think it is. If not, it's a high medium. But the point is, I give you this number, I give you a description and a remediation. Do you have the information you need to correctly understand the risk to your organization? I don't think you do, unless we give you context. And that's what, comprehensive, findings and things like that are all about.
Yep. Yeah. And that, the comprehensive nature of it is, here's this vulnerability. This is what it means. Here's what I can do with that. If an attacker was able to abuse this is what they'd be able to do. They'd be able to elevate their privileges, move laterally, and, take over the network, et cetera, but in more words, right?
Yeah.
So it's the comprehensive nature of it. It's not, a great finding is not just, hey, here's this, a cell vulnerability.
Yeah.
But
Well, I'll give you a great example of one that has a zero in our reports, right? Is the MSSP alerting that we put into reports where when we do a penetration test and there are no alerts generated, i.e., the client and their security team did not detect our activity at all for the duration of the engagement. That finding gets a zero point 0.0 CVSS score because effectively it's not it doesn't affect a specific system, right? There's not a way to calculate that. However, I would argue it might be the most important finding on that report. And so, I think that finding in and of itself illustrates well some of the gaps that things like CVSS create if you rely too much on them.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. CVSS is, does it impact the confidentiality, integrity, availability? If they didn't detect a password spray,
How do you calculate that? You don't, right?
right?
Because
Not easily
it's a
calculate.
negative. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that falls back on us, right? We have to communicate that clearly to the client.
Yep, exactly. And, carrying on, the finding itself is one thing, the description, the detailed nature of it, but also the remediations are important. So a great report is going to have a comprehensive section for remediation. It might be as simple as, trying to think of a simple example, right? Like group policy preferences, passwords and group policy preferences, right?
Mm-hmm.
The fix for that is to remove the group policy preference, right? Don't use group policy preferences for managing local accounts or for deploying things. Delete, the plain text credentials. If it's used anywhere, rotate the password. It's not super verbose for that finding, but other findings there are, right? There's complex mitigating factors that need to be in place, or the remediation isn't as straightforward. So the remediations should be, should be specific enough for the IT person to take that and go and address that vulnerability. Maybe there's linked to supporting resources and things like that. I think that's great to include as well. But I think the remediation should speak to here's how you address this thing. Here's how you can fix it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily have to give a 48-page white paper on how to remediate it,
Right.
but it should give the person enough information to go start addressing that issue.
Yeah, and this is something that we have made a direct and intentional effort to improve, just because, especially on the external pen testing stuff. And I wish Tyler was here because he could speak better to his work on that. But one of the things we ran into is it's really easy, like when you find an unpatched version of Apache, to be like, hey, patch Apache. But the problem with that is that's not always possible. What if it's embedded on a device? Right? Or what if that device is end of support, but your company can't get rid of it because it's a critical component of their infrastructure? Well, there are alternative options to help with that, right? Maybe you just proxy all traffic and you create an application firewall that protects against whatever attacks. So we like to include different options. It's not always as simple as fix your stuff. It could be, hey, that version of SSL you're running can't be fixed because that's an antiquated piece of hardware. Maybe you stick Cloudflare in front of it, right? Maybe you stick an SSL proxy out there, or and so those are just some really simplistic examples. But we like to dive deeper into alternative options other than the really obvious thing. The one you mentioned earlier, right? Using GP preferences. Yes, obviously the fix is to just remove that. However, how did we get there? Maybe we need to change our process. Maybe we need to reevaluate, because maybe that's baked into some IT manual from 10 years ago where they're like, yeah, make sure you enter the blah, 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 blah. And so, fundamentally, if we want to reduce the risk to the organization, we keep that from coming back. Right. Yep. And so those are the kind of things we want to see in the remediation.
Yeah. And the remediations can speak to, things that you can do additionally to harden, right? So a lot of our credential-based findings speak to the root cause, right? It's like, okay, delete that credential from that text file, but also, maybe set up a process to maybe set up a process to just, look at your file shares on a periodic basis, or, search your document management system for the word password every so often, and, set up a process to routinely, audit and clean that stuff out. Our findings can hopefully speak to those things that you can do to fix that thing now, like you said, but also things you can do as a matter of process, or as a matter of additional hardening to prevent that stuff from happening in the future, or just overall other mitigating factors, right? Maybe you can't exactly just get rid of that thing. We hopefully can offer additional recommendations to mitigate those things, and that's important too. Is these findings, the findings that we have, the recommendation or the remediations are recommendations, right? We're not telling you have to do anything. It's your environment, your security program. So these are recommendations for you to take, understand, and kind of implement in your organizations.
Yep, agreed. Yeah, and really, the links to supporting resources I think is really important. We are rarely, and this is something I picked up from Jim, our CIO, and he occasionally has something really cool to say. But I picked this up from him, and he says, it's rare that you're going to be the authority on a particular finding, and so if you are the authority on that finding, back your statements up. If you're not the authority, link to the authority, right? And so we want to, hey, this is your homework, this is your additional reading for this if you want to deep dive. And so I think that's the right approach for supporting resources.
I think that's really important too. Is linking to KPAC or whatever the framework is that kind of speaks to, okay, here's a little bit more information about what this vulnerability is, right? Maybe it's insecure access control. What does that exactly mean? How can I understand that from a risk perspective,
right?
To start to get to that root cause? Linking to MITRE ATT&CK for specific attack techniques that we use on internal pen tests or external, whatever the case may be. So, I think that's important too. Is recognizing that our findings are not just these made up things. Like, here's this issue. There's evidence to support why that thing is a risk.
Yep. Agreed. Okay, I think that's everything I have. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
The last thing is screenshots. So I think
screenshots, let's skip over that. Okay,
screenshots and supporting evidence. I think we do a great job of it here at Secure IT 360. But I think when you look at other reports or when you start in pen testing and you kind of undervalue the screenshots in doing them well, I think screenshots can make or break a finding, right? Let's say you have a finding, right, and you take a screenshot of the whole screen, and then that's it, right?
That's
or you take a screenshot, or you take a screenshot, you put a box or a red box around it, you draw an arrow, you highlight things, maybe you have some text to say, okay, here's what this screenshot is showing.
Yep.
There's a misconfigured ACL here, it leads to something here, and you kind of tell the story in the picture to go along with the finding, because the finding many times is going to be somewhat generic. It's insecure ACL, right? Okay, but here's the actual issue. Here's the path. Here's the folder. Here's the thing, and drawing and getting creative with how you articulate that through a screenshot or supporting evidence, I think is a really key feature of a great report.
And I'll add to that too. Having seen a million pen test reports in my life, that is how you tell somebody is legit, right? When you're reading their report and they have, screenshots that are not 7 million by 7 million resolution, but it is focused in on what's important. It's highlighted, arrowed, surrounded, and they have that level of detail that tells you that story in 2 or 3 screenshots or 4 or whatever it is. That's how you're working with a professional, in my opinion, right? Because anybody can grab one of these methodologies and pretend to go through a pen test, but somebody that will go to that detail, and they know what they're talking about with regards to what they're highlighting, stuff like that. It just tells you, hey, this dude or dudette is legit.
Yep. Yeah, and you can go the opposite direction, right? You can make it look like a John Mannon playbook. Probably not the best. Like,
I agree. You can't overdo it.
You can't overdo it. And I have done that before. I take a look, like I'll take the screenshot, right? And I'll do my annotating and stuff like that. And then I'll go to the draft and I'm like, that's a lot of arrows. That's probably a bit much. They could probably do with 2 or 3 less arrows in that screenshot.
I'd still rather have, somebody who overdoes it than somebody who has no screenshots or just like you said, takes a screenshot of their entire desktop. And you're just like, dude, I don't need to know what all tabs you have open, So
I think there's a lot of little best practices like that go into reporting, like redacting things and, making it suitable for all audiences and things like that, screenshots, supporting evidence. There's a lot of best practices, I think, that go into that. And I think, rightfully so. I think that's what makes a lot of pen test firms and just consulting firms is a bit of their secret sauce, right? Their methodology and their process and their workflow for creating a professional product
Yeah.
in that report. So there's a little bit, there's a little bit of a, secret sauce or like, industry, domain knowledge for crafting
Yeah.
something really well articulated in a report.
I agree. And to me, it just comes from experience. It comes from exposure. And, you on your 700th report, it's always going to be better than your third. And so, and we had the same evolution, right, in every different product that when we first started doing like mobile pen testing, for example, the reports weren't as flowed and flow as well. They're not as polished as they are now, and they'll continue to improve,
Yep.
forever, which I think is another good testament to, being a good shop.
Yeah. Yeah. And the last thing I think is, what makes a great pen test report is getting feedback from the client, from your team, from QA process, getting honest feedback on what's valuable, what to include in the report, making sure that there's not added fluff that doesn't need to be in there, but it's thorough enough and detailed enough for what it needs to be. And so getting feedback directly from clients, from teammates, I think is really important. And a report that changes over time, I think is also kind of a sign of a really great pen test report.
Yep. And you just hit on something. Last thing I really want to hit on is we were talking with a client. This has been about a month ago, and they were like, "Yeah, our last pen test we thought was really good, and it was like a 350-page report." And I was like, "Whoa, pump the brakes! You should never have a 350-page pen test report, right?" That to me is a red flag because they're not consolidating findings. They're not. It sounds like a vulnerability scan is what it sounds like to me, right? And so those are different things. And if your pen test report is 250 meg PDF, I don't think you got a pen test, right? And so it's super rare. I think probably the longest external pen test report we had, which is like a huge organization, was like 70 pages, and that's unusually large. And even more so for things like web and internal and stuff like that. So, remember, our goal here is to identify and communicate risk. That our goal is not to inundate you with a bunch of random findings, and those are different things. So, yeah, you just kind of hit on that, and it made me think, wow, we should talk about it. So cool. All right, folks, listen, that's all we have for you today. Thank you for listening and watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it. That's the best thing you can do to help us out and get the word out about what we're doing. We're releasing an episode every single Wednesday, usually in the morning. So come back, check us out next week, and we'll see you next time.